because the Bible does predict, Daniel chapter 7, verse 23, that one worldism, or the New World Order, is on the horizon, and the schools, to a large extent, are preparing these youth for this maximum global experiment in one world government.
Here in this slide, we have divine institutions: conscience, Genesis 3:22; marriage and family, Genesis 1:26 to 28, Genesis 2:18 to 25; labor, Genesis 2:15, Genesis 3:19; government, Genesis 9:6; nationalism, Genesis 11:1 through 9. What do you mean? What do you mean there, and what is the context for nationalism there?
Well, these divine institutions are all things you find in early Genesis, and they apply to Christians and non-Christians alike, believers and unbelievers. And these are, we call them institutions because these are things that the Creator has built into the fabric of fallen creation to help fallen creation, perpetuate itself in spite of the reality of sin. And they restrain man's sin nature. And once these institutions are eroded, there's nothing really left to restrain man's sin nature. And you have a situation just like before the flood where violence filled the whole earth. And when that happens, the judgment of God, whether it be a flood in the past or the tribulation period in the future, can't be far away. And so the one that's being eroded here, that Biden is saying, the kids really belong to the teachers and not the parents, is marriage and family. But nationalism was established by God at the Tower of Babel, where God was very clear that he doesn't want humanity ordered according to global government, because if man controls global government, he'll abuse it. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so what you'll notice with all five of these institutions is all of them are being severely eroded today, which shows us that, we're very, very close to the final judgment, because eventually there's going to be nothing left to hold back man's sin nature once these divine institutions disappear.
Yeah, because now we're going to talk about the Temple Mount in our prophecy update. Israel Today, Jewish World, getting ready. Temple Institute practices burning the red heifer. Now this, we knew that they were looking for the red heifer, trying to breed the red heifer. But folks, I've never seen a headline like this. They're now actually practicing burning the red heifer. Israeli professor involved in test of the red heifer ritual calls it an historical moment on the road to purity and redemption. Well, absolutely it's historical. I have never heard of a headline like this. Breeding for one, but actually now practicing burning the heifer and getting ready to use the ashes for purification of the temple. This is a first. So they must think they're getting very close, Dr. Woods.
Right, and of course Bible prophecy, as we've explained many times, predicts a third temple, which the Antichrist will desecrate midway through the tribulation. But what's interesting is when you go back to Numbers 19, the ashes of the red heifer mixed with water were necessary to dedicate the tabernacle and then later the temple. And so you can't have a temple without the ashes of the red heifer mixed with water for purposes of dedication, and you can't have the ashes of the red heifer in existence until you have a genetically pure red heifer, which has to be bred properly. So the fact that they're talking about this red heifer is really step one to rebuilding temple number 3, which will be step 2. And of course, as you know, Brandon, we're living in a time period of accelerated understanding of genetics. And so we're living in this time period where genetics and breeding, our knowledge of these things is now off the charts. And so we're now living in a season of time where you can conceivably have a genetically pure red heifer, which is necessary to rededicate temple number 3. And so it shows us that we're moving aggressively to temple number 3, ready or not.
Dr. Woods, inevitably when we talk about this, usually in the evening, however, there's a gentleman that comes on and he gets quite irate when we start talking about the third temple and the Jews and that we're somehow blaspheming God, that we're actually looking forward to this. It's not that this is going to be the tribulation temple. So it's not that we're excited about the idea of them making sacrifice, because we believe the sacrifice has already been done once and for all. Christ died for the sins of all who place their faith and trust in him. The Bible says that, John 3:16, we know, for God so loved the world, right? That whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. It's done. It's finished, he said. Debt paid in full. So it's not that we're excited about their setting up their tribulation temple and doing this from the perspective of agreeing with the need to sacrifice, because there is no need for sacrifice anymore. But the reason we look forward to this is because it tells us where we're at on God's prophetic calendar, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The thing to understand is the nation of Israel is doing this in unbelief.
Right.
I mean, they really don't realize that they are setting up the Antichrist temple. They think they're setting up the Messiah's temple, or what we would call later on the millennial temple. And so we're not saying, hey, this is great, let's get another temple going. We're just saying that this shows us that let's put it this way, the signs that when the Christmas songs and the Christmas lights come up in the department store, and Santa Claus comes out and the Christmas songs are on the radio, you know not just that Christmas is coming, but Thanksgiving is coming because Thanksgiving comes earlier in the calendar than Christmas. And so we look at these as signs of the tribulation, which means that the rapture of the church, which precedes the tribulation, is coming even faster. And so that's why we're excited. It's because of the rapture, not because we're somehow trying to supplement, the finished work of Jesus Christ with animal sacrifices.
Absolutely. Daniel 9:27, and he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, meaning a short period of time, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to a sacrifice and grain offering. And look at that, and grain offering. They're back to offering up tithes, by the way, folks. And what was tithe? Grain. And if you were too far from the temple, you took your tithe, turned it into money, and then when you got there, you took your money and turned it back into tithe. What's the first, second, and third tithe? Well, the first is for the Levites, what we're seeing here. The second is for yourself to eat food in the gates of your place where you live, or taking to the shadow of the temple in Jerusalem. And the third is the poor's tithe. But we've done a lot on that. But that's interesting that they were going to go back to this, grain offering, sacrificing grain offering. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. So there we go. That temple is going to be used in a way that is, again, look at the graph, right there in the middle of the tribulation. 7-year tribulation at the midpoint, 3.5 years in, Antichrist desecrates the temple and ends the sacrifices. So again, we're getting close. When we see all these things happening, the military alliances between Russia and Iran and Turkey, Syria, they're getting ready for the temple to be built. It's all lining up, folks. And we're commanded to watch for this, by the way. Dr. Woods is my guest. His website is andywoodsministries.org, andywoodsministries.org. We're doing our Friday Middle East Bible Prophecy Update. Let's go back to Israel's 4 temples. Solomon's temple, Zerubbabel's post-temple, Antichrist temple, millennial temple. You want to say anything about these?
Well, just to kind of piggyback on what was brought up prior to the break, is when you're looking at Israel, you're dealing with people, because you talked about them going back to the tithing system and all that. You're dealing with people that are functioning without the light of the New Testament. And so you can see how hemmed in their thinking is. And they're in a state of unbelief and blindness, and they currently think that they're actually doing their Messiah a favor, by building this temple. The reality is, when you look at the whole counsel of God's Word, they're actually building the Antichrist temple, and it's going to take his betrayal of them and desecration of their own temple to wake them up, really, and to bring them nationally to a state of faith in the Messiah, Yeshua, or Jesus Christ. And so that's the angle that we approach, when we look at these things. We're not trying to somehow supplement, animal sacrifices. We're not trying to bring back the tithing aspects of the Mosaic Law. We're looking at it specifically from the vantage point of potential fulfilled prophecy on the horizon, which means that the rapture of the church is coming even faster.
Absolutely.
This is another gentleman by the name of William Blackstone, and he wrote a book called Jesus is Coming, and he was kind of like a modern, kind of like Hal Lindsey or Tim LaHaye is in our day in terms of a bestseller. He released this book, and it was kind of a runaway bestseller. And in this particular book, he says Israel is God's sundial. He says if anyone desires to know our place in God's chronology, our position in the great march of events, look at Israel, close quote. And so that's how we look at Israel. The reborn state of Israel is the super sign of the last days. And all of these other signs that need to be considered, the mark of the beast or one worldism, those need to be considered alongside the super sign, which is a reborn state of Israel in unbelief. Because if you don't have that piece of the jigsaw puzzle in place, the whole prophetic scenario can't happen. And it's interesting, he made that comment about the sundial in 1908. That would be 4 decades before Israel was born through her War of Independence.
Let's go to Gog and Magog. Explain real quick to our audience what Gog and Magog is. I got a graphic there that kind of shows for those watching by television.
Well, it's that very interesting prophecy in Ezekiel 38 and 39, which predict a conglomeration of nations coming against Israel in the end times. And one of them is Rosh, or Russia, coming from the uttermost parts of the north, probably spearheading the invasion. And the other nation among several others mentioned is Persia, who we think is modern-day Iran. And so that's why I included a couple of news articles where essentially Iran and Israel, when you look at the back and forth, are right now, as we speak, in the middle of a Cold War. And it's not yet boiled over into a hot war, although it could, but they are involved in a Cold War. While everyone is focused on the Johnny Depp trial, this is what's happening in the real world of Bible prophecy. And the exact same thing is happening with Russia. Russia and Israeli tensions are increasing, and of course I include that in a prophecy update because that's what the prophet Ezekiel foresaw 2,600 years ago.
Here's Israel Today analysis. Will Israel and Russia drift further toward animosity?
Yeah, it's a really interesting article. It's basically related to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and Putin saying basically, I invaded Ukraine because of Nazi activity in Ukraine, and Israel came back and basically criticized him for that, and Putin came back and his cohorts saying, Hitler, was Jewish. Israel was saying, how could there be Nazi activity in Ukraine? Don't you know that Zelensky is Jewish? And Russia came back and said, well, Hitler was Jewish, and Israel came back and said, no, he wasn't. And so there's this whole back and forth going on, which is not, decelerating, if that's a word, tensions between Russia and Iran. That's actually heating up.
Tribulation judgments. You want to talk about that real quick? First half, second half?
Well, a lot of that relates to the kings of the East. And, for a lot of reasons, I believe that the kings of the East represent China. In fact, as you scroll through that, you'll see a quote by the late Dr. John Walvoord,
yep.
Who was a...
You want me to read it?
Well, sure.
He said, John Walvoord said, quote, if considered a literal enumeration of the army, it would represent the largest armed forces ever known to man. Considering the millions of people in the Orient, the literal interpretation is not impossible, especially in view of the population explosion. The passage is best understood as referring to the kings of the East, literally of the sun rising, referring to Oriental rulers who will descend upon the Middle East in connection with the final world conflict described a few verses later. The reasons seem to be weak for taking this prediction in other than its literal meaning. The rising power of parts of the Orient in our day in countries such as Japan, China, India, as well as lesser nations, makes such an invasion a reasonable prediction, end quote.
Yeah, by the time you get to the sixth trumpet judgment, Revelation 9, and the sixth bowl judgment around Revelation 16, verse 12, it talks about this massive army that numbers 200 million that makes its way from the Far East into the Middle East. And, of course, the geographical marker that delineates the Far East from the Middle East is Euphrates. And that river, according to Bible prophecy, is going to be supernaturally dried up to expedite the path of this eastern army that's summoned by satanic powers into northern Israel for the final battle, known as the Battle of Armageddon. And as that army is making its way into northern Israel, they destroy or wipe out 1/3 of the world's population. And I bring this up because a lot of people ask, where is China in Bible prophecy? And I'm of the persuasion that that's where China fits. In fact, that's what John Walvoord said in his commentary going all the way back to 1966. It's part of those Oriental powers consisting of perhaps Japan and India, but also China. And so that's why I included that article about China and Russia, looking at one another as strategic partners, to the point where one of our admirals is worried that the United States is not ready for this. We're not ready for these two powers to team up. And so a lot of people wonder, the alliance between Russia and China, is that setting the stage for Bible prophecy? I think it is, because China is that eastern power, and Rosh, or Russia, is mentioned as an invader of the land of Israel in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. And so when you see these two powers arise and are hostile to Israel and are actually cooperating with each other, calling each other strategic partners, that's just another example where God currently is setting the stage for the end-time drama.
Here's another headline, Israel Today. New developments in the covert Israel-Iran war. As hostilities escalate out of the public eye, the likelihood of a direct Iranian attack on Israel has increased greatly. This was just published 2 days ago, May 4th.
Yeah, I try to bring you, Brandon, really up-to-date articles.
And I appreciate that.
And this was one, where it's talking about literally, and it goes through a lot of different ins and outs. There's a lot of twists and turns in the article. But it's a fascinating read from the angle of Bible prophecy, because it's really talking about a Cold War that is now happening.
Well, look at this one. Iran was also behind the explosion of violence on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem during Passover. It has now become clear.
That's astounding, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, how many news outlets are even talking about this?
So at this time of course, I think Ramadan and Passover crossed each other this year. But, I mean, my word, again, where is the media on this, right?
Right. It's like it's just silence. And, the Johnny Depp trial or whatever it is people are focused on, that's where their heads are. And they're not talking about these major developments.
Well, like cyber attacks.
In our world.
Hackers from Iran attacked targets in Israel almost daily and managed to shut down the website of Israeli radio stations last week. And yeah, there's a lot going on. Foiled assassinations. Meanwhile, Israel does not stand idle by as Iran tries to hit the Jewish state in different ways.
There's a lot of confusion over this eastern power that's invading. A lot of people confuse the sixth trumpet with the fifth trumpet. And I have a chart there explaining the differences between the two, because people think this army is demonic.
Okay.
And no, it's not demonic. It's demonically influenced, but it's ultimately a human army, because the army in the fifth trumpet comes out of the abyss, which is basically it's a holding tank for demons, and it's actually where Satan is going to be incarcerated in the millennial kingdom. But the army that we're talking about here with trumpet number 6 is not coming out of the abyss. It's coming east of the Euphrates. So I think the army of 200 million is a very, very real human army, and it's to be identified with China as one of the possible players. And that's the position of Dr. John Walvoord in his Revelation commentary.
All right, let's get to Israel's 74th birthday. Israel's 74th birthday. State of Israel is born. Here's the Palestinian Post back in 1948, May of 48. And so let's discuss that real quick, Dr. Woods.
Well, we bring that up because that, really is the super sign of the end times, as we said before. Unless you have a reborn state of Israel in unbelief, that, the whole prophetic scenario, none of it will make any real sense. And so there's this article here from allisrael.com essentially showing what life was like for the Jewish nation when it was born with its War of Independence, May the 14th, 1948, and what it's like today. I mean, it's literally the miracle on the Mediterranean, and there's about 10 points the author makes comparing 1948 to today. I'll just draw one of them to your attention. It's number 6. In 1948, Israel's GDP, gross domestic product, was $5,000. Today, Israel's GDP is $467 billion. Compare that to what the nation was like in 1948, and you can see the hand of God, on that nation.
Country: Israel. Gross domestic product: Israel 123 billion, Egypt 81 billion, Syria 26 billion, Lebanon 21 billion, Jordan 12 billion. So Israel blows all of them away.
Yeah, and that's why Ezekiel 28 verse 12 and verse 13 talk about the reason for the invasion that's described in Ezekiel 38 and 39. It has to do with spoil and wealth.
Oh, by the way, those were from 2005. Those numbers I just gave you, 2005. Now look at 2021. They went from 123 billion in 2005 to now they're at 467 billion in 2021.
That's just astounding.
And they're still beating Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria.
And that's why this invasion is going to happen. So in order to set the stage for this, you have to have a reborn state of Israel in unbelief. Check, got that. And Israel has to become phenomenally wealthy. Check, that's happening right before our eyes. And so that's actually what whets the appetite of this coalition that Ezekiel 38 and 39 explains will invade Israel in the last days.
And by the way, here's another headline we should mention very, very quickly. U.S. Nuclear Forces Chief concerned by Russia-China cooperation. Well, he should be. So,
Sure.
There you go. Yeah?
And that's the kings of the East lining up with Russia.
Yeah.